Hit it.
Welcome to the Test Talks Podcast, the place to go to geek out on software testing. And now your host, whose mission is to help you succeed with test automation, Joe Colantonio.
Hey, it's Joe, and welcome to another episode of Test Talks. I always hear about how Ruby developers have embraced testing. So today, we're going to be test talking all about the Ruby testing culture from a developer's perspective with Jason Swett from codewithjason.com. Jason has a bunch of courses and articles on his blog about Ruby testing, and he shares his testing knowledge on a whole bunch of topics with us today. Check it out. Test Talks is sponsored by the fantastic folks at Sauce Labs, the cloud-based automated testing platform that eliminates the need to maintain your own Selenium grid and test infrastructure. Try it for free today. Visit testtalks.com and click on the Sign Up Now link under the homepage sponsor section. Hey, Jason. Welcome to Test Talks.
Hey, Joe. Thank you.
It's great to have you on the show. I just met you at MicroConf, so it was really great to meet you and actually see and talk to you about what you're doing. It sounds really exciting. You're doing a lot of interesting things with Ruby, especially Ruby with testing. You have a great course on it. So I'd like to dive into all those things. But before we do, can you just tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Sure. So I'm a software developer. I've been doing that, at least as a hobbyist, since I was a kid in the mid-90s. I think I found like a Pascal book my dad had, and I just started working out of that because my dad was a programmer too. But anyway, I've been programming for a really long time. Never really was involved with testing until around 2011. And that's when I started trying to write automated tests as a programmer and eventually gained competence on that. And now it's something I teach to other programmers.
Awesome. So I've mentioned this before on other episodes. It seems like a skill that not all developers embrace, which is testing. So what happened in 2011 that made you see the light and go, testing?
So between 2005 and 2011, I was working mainly with PHP. And at that time, there was not a strong testing culture in the PHP community. In 2011, I made a switch from PHP to Ruby on Rails. And in the Rails world, there is a strong testing culture. And so that's how I got involved with that. It took me quite a long time to get comfortable with it, but that's what gave me my start.
A few things I like to talk about, obviously, is Ruby and testing, but specifically, we were talking before the show started. A topic came up called testing legacy code. This is something I'm sure a lot of testers deal with. So you have a great article on your blog called Taming Legacy Using Ruby Code Using the Sprout Method. So I thought we'd dive into that a little bit. Could you just tell us a little bit more? What is the Sprout Method, or any tips around testing legacy code?
Sure. So there's this really great book I read years ago. I have it right in front of me right now, actually. It's called Working Effectively with Legacy Code by Michael Feathers. And it discusses earlier in the book, what is legacy code? Because it's kind of a nebulous idea. People might have different definitions of it. The author of this book has a pretty interesting definition of legacy code. He simply defines it as code without tests. And that was a different definition that I had kind of heard elsewhere or conceived of myself. So I thought that was interesting. The challenge with legacy code is that kind of inherent in the idea of legacy code is that it's messy, hard to work with code. And maybe the original maintainers are gone. And so you have to maintain forward momentum still with feature development because the business still has requirements for features, but you're often afraid to touch it because if you touch anything, you're afraid things will fall apart. You can gain confidence by adding some tests so that you can have some assuredness that when you make a change, you're not going to break things if you have test coverage. But there's kind of a catch-22 situation. That is, you can't put tests on the code without changing it, but you don't want to change the code without putting tests on it first. And so it's kind of like, how do you get past that catch-22? The author of this book describes this method that he calls the Sprout method technique. And I should make a distinction there because the word method has more than one meaning.
All right.
When he says method, he means function. So the sprout method technique means you take this chunk of code. Let's say you have a file that's, 1,000 lines long and you don't understand what the heck it does. So you're afraid to like break this code apart into smaller, more understandable pieces. So rather than trying to modify it, you might take a chunk of that file. Like out of that 1,000 line file, you might take a chunk of 50 lines, and without modifying those 50 lines at all, you just move those 50 lines into their own file, and you put those 50 lines in their own function or method. And so that's where the name comes from. You sprout these 50 lines out into their own separate method, so that you can begin to address that part of the code and understand it and ultimately put some tests around it.
Awesome. That's actually a great idea. And I love that definition, legacy code, just code that doesn't have tests for it, because then it really blows your mind almost like, okay, I understand that. And a lot of people probably have that. So are there any areas of low-hanging fruit that you recommend starting with to actually look at when you're dealing with code that doesn't have tests for them?
I'm trying to think. So usually when I'm looking at a piece of code that I want to understand, I'll start by doing just that. I'll take the entirety of the code, and the idea is like I don't want to change anything before I put some test coverage on it. So I imagine you, Joe, and your audience are probably familiar with the concept in programming of test-driven development.
Yep.
So obviously the idea is you write the test before you write the code to be sure that every piece of code you write is covered by tests. But if the code already exists and there's no test, then it's too late to do TDD. But I've kind of developed a technique. I don't know if I picked this up from this book or from somebody else, or I just kind of evolved it myself. But the technique is to kind of do retroactive TDD. So I'll take a file. It might be mysterious. I don't understand what it does, but I'll take it and I'll kind of comment out most of the contents of the file, or I'll delete the lines of the file. But usually I'll comment out a good chunk of the file, and then I'll write some tests for what I think the code might do. And then, so I'll write my first test will fail. Then I'll uncomment one of the lines of the code that I think will make it pass. And let's say it does make it pass. Okay, so then I've kind of like retroactively TDD'd that line of code. And so I'll go through that process, and I won't uncomment any part of the file until I've written a test that covers it. So then by the time I'm done and all the lines are uncommented, I have tests for everything. And then I'm free to totally rearrange things however I want and just clean up the code really freely without being concerned that I'm breaking things.
I guess a question someone might ask is, how do you know the test you're adding is actually adding value? And you're not just adding just overhead of just doing tests for the sake of test.
Well, there's some discernment. Like you just have to use some judgment as far as like, what is the feature that I'm testing? And does it make any sense? So that's just a judgment call part of it. But usually, if the code exists in the program, it does something important. And so when you're writing tests for it, you can be pretty certain that test has value. And it's kind of like, not all, I think actually you were talking about this. I listened to an episode with Kent C. Dodds, and I think you and he kind of touched on this idea of test coverage, and not all of the parts of your application are equally, they don't get equal traffic and they don't have equal importance. And so you're going to have kind of a feel for which parts of your applications get more usage and which are like in the critical path of what the business needs. And that's another heuristic you can use. If you spend time testing things that only get used once every 6 months by like 3 people, that's probably not huge value. But if you're testing something that tons of people use every single day, then clearly that's more valuable.
Another issue that sometimes happens is folks write unit tests just to get it to pass. And they don't necessarily think about this is going to have to run on every build for the next forever. So Is there any way you future-proof your test or think about that as you're writing a unit test that maybe hard-coding data here that I may need to think a little more strategically about this?
Yeah, I actually just wrote something about this recently. That's just something you have to be careful about, and think if you're hard coding a date, what happens? Like I was writing something the other day where I was testing a credit card expiration just for one of my educational posts. And the future date was 2030. And that's in the future now. But what about in the year 2031? The year 2030 is, of course, not in the future. So I just changed my test to use a relative date instead of absolute. So yeah, those are things that you have to think about when you're writing tests.
Now, you mentioned that, a lot of people they'll look at a class and it may have 1,000, 2,000 lines of code. They get kind of scared. They don't want to touch it. And you have a great approach that you just start with smaller chunks of code that you start extracting them out into their own separate class. Are there any other roadblocks or obstacles you see to developers being hesitant about writing tests for their code?
There's a lot. With legacy projects in particular, one thing that's a challenge, like even if the developers are totally bought in and they want to write tests, legacy projects often have a bunch of tangled up dependencies. And so that can be an obstacle. And a solution to that, again, is just to pull out parts of the code so you don't have a big, long file. And instead of having like global values that get passed around, create separate functions that take arguments. That way, your functions that take arguments can be tested individually, and you don't have to spin up like an instance of this big class that has a whole bunch of different variables that get passed around inside that class. It's easier to test the functions individually if they take arguments rather than depending on globals. So that's one. Just to state that more broadly, anything you can do to break down dependencies in your code can make it easier. But I think maybe what you were more asking, Joe, is are there any forces that make it so that developers are resistant to writing tests at all in the first place?
Right.
And the biggest thing that I've seen is people don't feel like they have permission to take the time to write tests. It's one of those things where people are too busy sawing to sharpen the saw. They know, maybe intellectually they know that if they were to take the time to write tests, it would theoretically save them time in the long run, but maybe they don't like believe that in their gut. They just, they think it, but they're not really, they haven't experienced it or whatever. Or again, they don't feel like they have permission to take time from doing quote unquote real work to spend time writing tests. And the solution to that problem is solved differently depending on at what level that problem exists. So there's a number of possible scenarios. One is that leadership is bought into the idea of testing, but the development team is not. Or it can be the other way around, where the development team is bought into testing, but leadership is not. But whatever the case may be, well, let's address these individually. If leadership is bought into the idea of testing, but the developers are not, I think what leadership can do is just explicitly tell the development team that, hey, you really do have permission to take the time to write tests, because we know that if we do that and we write tests that are actually adding value, that in the long run and even in the medium run, it's going to save us time because we're going to deliver higher quality software. We're going to have fewer bugs. It's going to reduce our development cycle time because we don't have to spend as much time on manual QA. So please take the time to do that. And there's processes that can be implemented too. Like you can have code reviews before any features go out, and as part of the code review process, you can have like a checklist, and one of the checklist items can be, does this have reasonable test coverage? And so that's how I think that can be overcome when the issue is that the development team is not bought into writing tests. When leadership is not bought into testing, that's a little bit harder. quite frankly, what I would do if I were in that position is just write test anyway. And if I get in trouble for it, then I get in trouble for it. But I would just kind of do that because I know that that's going to result in higher quality work overall. And if that creates some kind of problematic situation, then quite frankly, maybe I'm not working at the right place.
So, yeah, I thought it was me. I was older and that this is why a lot of developers don't do testing, but it has a lot to do with culture and even young people that are coming into development for some reason. Is there a stigma with testing? Like for some reason where I work, maybe it's just where I work, when people hear testing, they think QA. And that's not the testing we're thinking about. They even when we have a sprint retro and we say, why did this bug go into production? And they said, oh, we thought there was a UI test that took care of this, even though it was like a null exception with an array that would be better at a unit test. Yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
I'm not sure. I've been in the Ruby and Rails world so long that I'm kind of familiar with that, and that's kind of all I know. The only other kind of culture that I've had exposure to is the JavaScript world. My perception as far as JavaScript goes is that years ago there was, it was inconceivable that you would write automated tests for the JavaScript code. And these days you see a lot more like for React, there's Jest, and for other technologies, there's Jasmine. And you see a lot more people testing JavaScript code. So I think like in general, the software industry is putting more and more emphasis on testing, but I haven't had enough exposure to say like the Java world or .NET world to really be able to understand what the testing culture is like in those communities.
So that's another great point. So we are talking Ruby, and I actually don't have many episodes about Ruby. So to someone that's brand new to it, what tools do you use to help you with testing when you're dealing with Ruby code?
Good question. So I'm actually putting together a glossary right now of testing terms because there's just so many of them and there's so many tools. But there's kind of two levels. There's the unit level testing and there's the integration level testing. So at the unit level, I use RSpec, and then I use this tool called FactoryBot, which it's a tool to spin up database data so that I can create data structures in a way that's convenient and not repetitive. And then I use a tool called Database Cleaner so that each time I run my test suite, I'm starting each individual test with a clean slate and then cleaning up afterward. Those are some of the tools I use for unit level testing. And then when I do integration testing, I use all those same ones, but also a tool called Capybara, which allows me to drive the browser.
So I know there's a few choices when doing Ruby UI-based testing, doing basically browser automation. So there's Capybara, there's Selenium, and there's Water. Why did you choose Capybara?
Yeah, for Capybara, Selenium, I'm pretty sure is like, I don't know if it's the default, but it's one of the two main drivers that people use for their integration tests. So you can do it one of two ways, and I haven't had to dig down into the details of it very much lately, but you can either do it headlessly or you can do it not headlessly. I actually prefer not to do it headlessly because I like to be able to see the actual browser being pulled up, and I like to see the UI getting exercised, especially because when it runs into a snag, like either the test is written improperly or the UI is behaving unexpectedly, I like to be able to actually see what's happening visually.
Cool. So I'm just thinking of JavaScript for UI front-end developers. As they're developing their code, in the background, they could have their test run and give them feedback. Is that the same approach that you use, or is it actually just kicking off a browser and waiting for it to complete? Is it all automated that when you create some code, you can have some tests that will kick off for you automatically?
So people do use certain tools. There's one called Guard, and tell me if this is what you're talking about or not. Like when you save the file, it'll automatically kick off your test suite. Yeah, that's exactly what Guard does. I tried out Guard years ago, and I didn't like it because I preferred to control when my test suite gets kicked off. I'm one of those people who saves like every 10 milliseconds, And so it didn't make sense for me to be using that tool. I use a tool where I can kick off a keystroke when my cursor is sitting on a certain line, and it'll run. I use TMUX, and so I'll have like a left pane and a right pane. My left pane will have my code. My right pane will have my tests. And so when I have my cursor on a certain line of my test, I can hit \S and it will run that particular test in my testing pane. Or I can hit \T and it'll run all the tests in that whole file. Or I can hit \A and it'll run my whole entire test suite. So that's the workflow that I've kind of found to work well for me.
Awesome. So you mentioned unit testing and integration testing. How do you know when to do one over the other?
So for me, it's kind of a pyramid with unit testing at the base and integration testing at the top. There's a Martin Fowler article that kind of describes this testing pyramid. And I had never, somebody else mentioned the pyramid to me, and I'm like, oh, hey, that makes sense. But I'd always thought of it kind of this way of having a large number of fine-grained unit tests and a small number of coarse-grained integration tests. And my reasoning for that is integration tests are expensive to write and to run. So the reason I say expensive to write is because there's a lot that goes into spinning up a page and finding the exact UI elements, typing into a form, for example, finding the submit button and clicking it. And then on the running side, those tests just take a long time to run relative to unit tests. So for the integration tests, I just write those for the happy path. So I don't test edge cases normally in integration tests. Like to continue with the form example, I might write an integration test where I put all valid inputs in all my fields, and then I click submit. And then I might have one more integration test where I leave a field blank and verify that an error message appeared on the screen. But I'm not going to test all the wild use cases. Like I'm not necessarily going to test empty string, single space, string that contains 5,000 numbers or something like that. I'm not going to test all those edge cases. Those are where I would drop down to the unit level and write a large number of fine-grained tests there. So to kind of summarize that, a lot of fine-grained unit tests, small number of coarse-grained integration tests.
I know you're also a corporate trainer. Is there anything you see from folks when you're trying to teach them Ruby testing that they struggle with or they didn't know about?
Well, a lot of the people who I teach aren't very familiar with testing at all.
Okay.
Part of that is because a lot of my students have been either recent college graduates, or in one case, I teach a class where it's college sophomores, that age range,
okay,
or recent hires who recently graduated college. And for whatever reason, automated testing is not really taught in computer science programs. And so the students I get, they won't be very familiar with testing. And usually with those classes, the focus won't be testing. And I don't even try to get into it because we're covering so much ground with the other technologies that it would just be too much to try to take on at once to try to add testing as well. But yeah, my experience is that most people, at least at an entry level, have no exposure at all to testing.
So when you're teaching testing, then what are your thoughts on pair programming? Do you actually have them do peer testing or pair programming? What are your thoughts on pair testing in general, I guess, or pair programming?
Well, I always pair people up in class. It's kind of funny. Like in school, we're taught that collaboration is cheating,
right,
which is crazy because collaboration is like the only way we work in the actual workforce. So it's really not a good preparation for the workforce to have people work individually. So I always pair people up, and I try to do it in such a way that I have maybe somebody who's more comfortable paired up with somebody who's less comfortable. I have people kind of self-select. I say, who here feels really comfortable with this stuff, who maybe could use a little more help. And I try to pair them up in such a way that the more comfortable people can help. Because if I pair up, here's what people will tend to do if I let them select their own pairs, is the people who are kind of more toward the beginner end of the spectrum, they will cluster up into a group because they feel like safe with the other people who are at their level.
Yep.
And then the advanced people will cluster in another group, and it's really not helpful because then the earlier people just get stuck. So I try to mix it up that way. But to answer your question, it's definitely super helpful, and people go a lot faster when they pair up.
Awesome. So you mentioned that, a lot of people that you train are newbies to Ruby programming and maybe even Ruby testing in general. Are there any courses or other services you provide to actually help people to actually go deep if that's where they're at and they want to learn more about Ruby testing?
Sure. So there's the material that I put out myself at codewithjason.com. That's my main focus is Ruby testing at codewithjason.com. What exists on my site right now is fairly cursory. I have like an intro level course if people are interested in beginner level stuff. But if people want to go deeper, this book that I mentioned already is Working Effectively with Legacy Code by Michael Feathers. That is a great testing resource. It's not Ruby specific, but it's all of it applies. I'm just looking at my bookshelf. There's this book called Growing Object-Oriented Software Guided by Tests. And that's a great book. I read that kind of early on. That taught me a lot of really good fundamental testing concepts. And then my last kind of resource that I'll recommend, it's not necessarily testing focused, but it is Rails focused. And that is the Michael Hartle Rails tutorial. And I think that's just railstutorial.com. If you Google Rails tutorial, it'll be one of the first things that come up.
All right, Jason, before we go, is there one piece of actionable advice you can give someone to help them with their Ruby testing efforts? And let us know the best way to find or contact you.
Sure. So probably the number one thing that holds beginners back from getting tested is just that they don't know where to start. So my advice to those people would be, if you're trying to get started writing tests for Ruby on Rails, I would actually advise you not to try to write tests for Ruby on Rails. Just write some tests for only Ruby. So write something as simple as you possibly can. Put together a tiny, really simple Ruby class or Ruby file that's just a few lines. Write the simplest test you can possibly think of. And once you've done that, add a little bit, make it a little bit more complex. Once you're comfortable with that, keep going. And I think you'll find that once you're over that hump, continuing will be a lot easier. You just need to get over that initial step of just getting started. So that would be my advice. And then if you want to find me and my material, the best starting point is codewithjason.com. And you can, if you go to the homepage there, you'll find a list of a bunch of places you can go.
Thank you, Jason, for your Ruby testing awesomeness. For links to everything of value we covered in this episode, head on over to testtalks.com/215. And while you're there, make sure to click on the sign up for free trial link under the exclusive sponsor section to learn all about our awesome sponsor, Sauce Labs. So that's it for this episode of Test Talks. I'm Joe, and my mission is to help you succeed with creating automation awesomeness. As always, test everything and keep the good. Cheers.
Thanks for listening to the Test Talks podcast. Head on over to www.testtalks.com for full show notes, amazing blog articles, and other automation awesomeness.